Chapter 9. September 9th, 2021 continued. The Dog Trainer. We sat silently for what seemed like a long time, both of us trying to calm down. Of course, Larry owed him an explanation. Was I a good guy who saw or learned about something he wasn't supposed to? Or was I a dangerous criminal making a deal with Witsec? I didn't blame Dr. Jensen one bit, because I had no fucking idea. And if the marshals knew, they weren't telling me. In less than an hour, I would be gone from his life forever, the threat removed. His anger and embarrassment for allowing me to put him and his people at risk would fade over time. My anger at not knowing who killed Gabriella and ripped my life apart would grow into an all-consuming rage. And at that moment, I really didn't give a damn if Larry had hurt the doctor's feelings. I glared at him and snarled, "Yeah, and it's all my fault. Of course I didn't shoot myself, inject something into my head, use your toys, or make the call to leave here. Oh, and I still have no fucking idea if I will be okay or fall over dead in this room. But hey, the important thing is that you're pissed off." It turned out that the old doctor was old school. There was no doubt he was angry with Larry's high-handedness, but it was more than that. His big hands clenched and unclenched as he struggled to control himself. "Yeah, I'm pissed off because I don't have a fucking clue if you're healed, if you will drop dead in a minute. How can we even be having this discussion, all on top of the big question, why are you still alive? I don't even know what the hell I'm looking at in these images. I can't tell where the gel starts and your brain cells begin," he said. "Well, get someone who can," I yelled. "I can't. I don't know who you are. And your marshal has made it clear that I can't talk about you to anyone." "Fine. I'll stick around and tell Dr. Weeble to give me whatever you need." "No," he said in a flat voice. "No? You can't stay here," he said with a long sigh. "So you came here to tell me that you don't know anything. Great. Thanks for that," I said, rising to my feet. "Ben, sit down. I didn't come here to give you a prognosis." He stared me back into my chair. "Okay, what can you tell me?" I asked. He leaned forward and spoke slowly. "I have a legal responsibility to you as a patient, as does this facility, to answer your questions." "What questions?" About what?" I replied. He looked away from me, his irritation returning. I saw his right hand slip into his coat pocket. "Wait, are you recording this?" I barked. He frowned at me and said, "No, Ben, the last thing I want is a recording of this meeting. And Deputy Burns tells me he feels the same way. Why would you ask that?" "Your hand, the one in the coat pocket," I replied. He looked down at his hand in surprise and shook his head. Then the edges of his mouth twitched as he pulled out a dog collar and put it on the table. He extracted a small box with dials and an antenna from the other pocket and laid it next to the collar. There was a glimmer in his eyes that made me edge back. He grinned almost apologetically. "It's a training collar for the pup. Most people don't know how to use them the right way. You don't give them a jolt, more like a tap on the shoulder to remind them to focus. Speaking of which, do you have any questions for me?" "I guess I could ask about my treatment," I said, as I carefully took a chair. He nodded, cocked his head, studied my neck, and began adjusting the collar. "Or maybe start with what kind of place this is," I said quickly. "An excellent start," he murmured, putting the collar back on the table. "This is a private hospital, a very private hospital," he said. "Private as in?" I asked. "Members only," he replied. "And to be a member, you have to be... let's put it this way, most members can fund a ride into space." "Oh, okay, that puts it out of my range," I said. "A couple of them own their own rocket," he added with a slight smile. I politely returned the smile, wondering why the help always found it necessary to drive home the point. Then I noticed his finger tapping on the collar. I told myself to focus. "Wow, those guys are members?" I asked. He grasped the collar between his fingers and stared intently into my eyes. "I said they could afford to, not that any members do or don't own a rocket." "Ben, are you a family member or friend of a member?" "Are you asking me to see if I know?" He set the collar down. We were moving in the right direction. Both. Members I know. If it's family, generally everyone knows and is constantly reminded hourly. Of course, the security is a giveaway. Friends, not so much. Marshal escorts? Not ever on my watch. But you never know these days. I don't think you're family, but friend, maybe. Are you a friend of a member? He watched as I thought about it longer than it required. No, Dr. Jensen, I'm not family or a friend. Friend of a friend? I seriously doubt it. He nodded and said, So do I, and I think family is out. Yeah, I suppose you know family, I said. He shook his head. No, like I said, only when they announce themselves. He touched the side of his face and said, Besides, if you were family or even friends, those scars wouldn't show by now. That is something we would have been asked to take care of. His finger lightly touched the collar, and I straightened up in my chair. The guy was one hell of a dog trainer. Let's move on. You mentioned treatment, and I am legally bound to tell you what I know. Are you sure we're not being recorded? I asked. He grunted. Who the hell knows? I always assume it. There isn't that much to tell, really. You were flown in on a private jet. We have a jet-capable airstrip, of course. When you arrived, you were in an induced coma. Shortly afterward, Dr. Wiebel took you out of the coma and heavily sedated you. That was 15 months ago. What do you remember? I had given it a lot of thought and said, Nothing really. Vague impressions until I woke up 2 days ago. I know I talked to the nurses and maybe even you, but the first thing I remember is Deputy Burns sitting beside my bed. After that, I think I remember everything. Dr. Jensen frowned at the image of my brain rather than me for a long time. Finally, he said, From the day you were admitted here, our role was strictly confined to nursing care and physical therapy, especially after you became ambulatory, which happened surprisingly quickly. After that, Dr. Wiebel brought in a team who performed all the testing and medicating. Dr. Wiebel did not say what was in the medications, and as your primary care provider, that was not required. This is one of the few places he could have played that card. He paused and looked down at the table, his big face growing angry. He barely glanced at me, and instead seemed to be talking to my MRI. Fuck it. You've made it clear that you don't like medical jargon, so here it is. You were the walking dead. When my MRI didn't answer, he turned his glare on me. Or, more accurately, after each round of testing, you were heavily sedated, presumably to allow exact mapping of the affected regions of your brain. Dr. Wiebel brought in the MRI machine you spent the day in yesterday. We've only heard of ones like it, and for us, that says something. Then you would call it wake up. You could walk. And gradually you spent much of your time on a treadmill, bicycle, and even swimming. You responded to basic commands and never communicated. It was fucking weird. Then you would relapse and sink back into almost a coma state. It was as if it was induced, but why would anyone do that? I didn't like it. Then why did you do it? I asked. He jerked his head back as if I had slapped him. For a moment, we both thought he was leaving. Then he chuckled, shook his head, and gave me a rueful look. I've been asking myself that lately. Much of what we do here is no different from any doctor's office or hospital. We treat things that will get better by themselves. And we do a lot of rehab work, drugs, alcohol, you name it. If it's serious, we'll get you to Mayo, Cleveland Clinic, etc. But mainly, we are here to treat any problem you have as life-threatening. We take you seriously to give the rest of the family a break from your complaining. He stopped and looked around the room, obviously remembering something he'd said about recordings, then grinned as if embarrassed. Then you came here. A medical miracle. Shouldn't have gotten off the table alive. Shouldn't be ambulatory. It felt like we were making history, I guess. Then, over a month ago, you had a very long relapse for no apparent reason. Dr. Wiebel personally showed up to conduct an extensive series of tests. Then he stopped visiting. When I finally managed to get him on the phone, he said the gel, as he called it, in your brain was decomposing. He instructed me to keep you on life support until he could come here to run the final tests. He shook his head and frowned at me. You know the sad part? If he hadn't treated me like I was his errand boy, I might have done what he asked. But instead, I got pissed off and grew some balls. I ordered your meds cut back and you responded. You became ambulatory and I cut them back more. Then I pulled you off all the meds and you essentially woke up. That was when all hell broke loose. Weeble called. I always knew he had spies. He couldn't believe it when I told him you were communicating in a minimal sense. Said he was on his way. He paused once again, staring at my MRI. I reached across the table and tapped the collar, and after giving me a sharp look, he resumed. Less than an hour later, he called. He said that after reflection, he had decided that my irresponsible actions put you at extreme risk. He ordered me to put you back on your medication immediately. He glanced at the MRI, and I said to the side of his face, "And you told him?" "I told him fine," he replied. I was looking at my MRI when I heard a tapping sound. Dr. Jensen gently laid the collar back on the table. "When the little shit arrived, you were sedated. Don't look at me like that. We talked, and the more you talked, the more agitated you became. Ben, you are in WITSEC. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know who you are. Nor did I want my people hearing anything." He smiled. "Besides, Deputy Burns flies commercial." "You called him?" "Of course. He's a federal officer of the law." "And told him what?" "Nothing about your medical condition, only that you were conscious and talking. Dr. Weeble wanted you back on your medication, and I didn't," he said. "And that brought him running?" He nodded. "It did. He asked what you were saying. I told him nothing important and that I was sedating you. He said he was on his way." "And why would Weeble want me back on the meds, assuming it wasn't for my own good?" His eyes drifted to my last MRI. I was finished with his games and stood. His eyes pinned mine and pulled them to the MRI on the screen. The pointer on the screen traced the gel, or whatever the hell it was. Dr. Jensen's eyes narrowed, and it came to me. "It was never about me, was it?" I asked. "We went over this. Are you family or friend?" I met his eyes. "That's not what I'm asking, and you know it." His jaw tightened as his eyes moved to my MRI on the screen. Like a bird dog hunting for quail, the cursor moved about the screen, searching for that place where Weeble's magic medium stopped, and my brain cells began. At first, I thought he was stalling, and maybe he was, but it felt like the magnetic forces that created the image were inexorably pulling at his eyes. Finally, he looked at me. "I'm sorry, you're right. I think this is all about what's inside your head. That said, what I don't know, and hopefully never will, is why you ended up with bullets in your head. Here is what I know. A highly respectable neurosurgeon and a marshal with WITSEC bring, essentially a vegetable to my hospital at the start of the pandemic. Being admitted requires a member, and don't ask me who because I honestly don't know." His eyes fled to the screen as though addicted, as I closed my mouth. He seemed to have trouble returning them to me. I reached across the table and tapped his dog collar. With a wry smile and a nod, he continued. "It's possible that Dr. Weeble somehow thought you would recover. Neurosurgeons are arrogant. They have to be. But if that was the case, why not fix your face? Again, sorry, but we only have an hour." Deputy Burns made that clear. "You need to understand that this is one of the few places in the world where cost is not an issue. We don't even track costs by the patient. A member agrees to sponsor you and doesn't even ask to have us repair the damage on your face? That doesn't make any sense, unless the member isn't concerned about you, per se." He paused. I waited. Dr. Jensen was once again talking to my MRI, not me. When the MRI image stayed mum, he continued. "No, they were bringing me a specimen, not a patient. And like I explained, while this is unusual in civilians, I have seen too much of it when operating on people who served their country. I watched them die because I could do nothing about this level of damage." With a visible effort, he pulled his eyes back to mine. "It is impossible for you to be having this conversation. Do you understand me? Do you understand me, Ben or whoever you are? That's not possible." He thrust out his arm like a sword at the MRI. "Do you have any idea how important this is? What this could mean? Ben, there is no way your brain is rewiring around the damage. Somehow Weeble's gel has become a working part of your brain. How is this being kept a secret from our government? Or is it? I have no idea, and that drives me crazy. Oh, sorry. I guess my bedside manner needs some work. He picked up his tablet with a sigh, and the aspen trees returned to the wall. Am I crazy? I asked. No, lots of people have life-threatening problems and won't talk to their doctors. What's crazy about that? He replied dryly. I take it I'm healed? I asked quietly. Dr. Jensen shook his head apologetically. Ben, I doubt Dr. Weeble knows the answer. I sure as hell don't. Come on, give me something. You're a doctor, I pleaded. Ben, has the medium stopped merging with your brain cells? If not, how much of your brain will be affected? Will it deteriorate? Is it deteriorating? And since you asked my opinion, my guess is that Dr. Weeble doesn't have those answers either. So how in the hell can you get those answers? The same way we do with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. For fuck's sake, is there a reason you can't speak English? Oh, I'm sorry, Ben. I didn't realize that you're an alien from another planet. CTE? You know, the reason football players lose their shit? And sure, we can get the answers. All I have to do is autopsy your brain. He slammed his hand down on the collar. I focused and then collapsed back in my chair. That's why Weeble wanted me back on his drugs, I said. I didn't say that. All I said is that this is the only way he or anyone will ever know what the hell is happening inside your head. So what is going to happen to me? I asked, forcing myself to look him in the eye. Having done this part many times and places, he met my eyes. I guess if nothing changes, you stay as you are. If it grows or deteriorates, I expect you will start having serious problems. Given the location of the damage, I would expect, at minimum, that you can expect personality disorders, insomnia, hallucinations. Hell, the works. Then things get terrible. I heard my voice tremble as I asked. So, unless whatever has happened is finished and stable, it's all over. How long? Dr. Jensen surprised me with a soft smile. I think it is moving slowly. In fact, Dr. Weeble, who tested you every 2 weeks, thought things were over. Obviously, he was wrong. There's no way of knowing, but you may have time. I'm sorry, I have no idea how long. I started laughing, and his big face wrinkled in concern. Maybe I had just run out of time. I laughed harder. Doc, this must be Weeble's worst nightmare. His lab rat is about to disappear. I thought it was at least worth a laugh. After staring at me for a moment, he actually started to reach for the damn collar. I cut off my laugh and shook my head in warning. The muscles in his jaw twitched. He wasn't going to explain. Was he testing my sanity? Finally, I said, Okay, why is Deputy Burns making me disappear? Who is he protecting me from? It can't be Weeble. He and Burns brought me here. And I get Weeble wanting to keep his lab rat around. But I'm his success story. I must be worth a fortune, given what you've told me, right? Dr. Jensen unclenched his jaw and said quietly, Ben, what's in your head may be priceless. I shook my head. Come on, priceless? I mean, really, Doc? He spoke so quietly that I had to lean forward. Something is in your brain, and it has replaced cells in your brain. It has replaced cells in your brain, Ben. Maybe it doesn't age. Maybe it can be replaced when it wears out. Ben, do you know what that would mean? At least he didn't bring the damn dog collar back into our conversation when I only stared back at him, my brain now feeling like it would explode. In a low voice, he said, Theoretically, it could mean a brain could live forever. When I still didn't answer, his gaze drifted to my forehead as if he had X-ray vision. My brain live forever? His chuckle surprised both of us. Sorry, Ben. Yeah, that's a scary thought, he grunted. But my brain is now, what, worth a fortune? Is that why a member let me in? I said, unsure how to take that comment. He shook his head immediately. He had thought about this. Ben, members don't need more money. What you have in your head is priceless, only as long as the only people who can afford it are those who can afford spacecraft. So is Deputy Burns taking me away to help them or hide me from them? He shook his head again and said, I've thought about this. Weeble and Burns may be working together, but honestly, I don't think so. Burns wants you out of here before you say something we shouldn't hear. And to be honest, I agree with him completely. You do? Ben, I don't know why you're in WITSEC, and I don't want to know. And once WITSEC pulls you out of here, our problems with Dr. Weeble are over. I leaned forward. And if Deputy Burns is somehow tied to Weeble? He shrugged. You would have a better idea than I do on that. Why do you say that? His brow furrowed as he studied me before saying, As I said, I don't want to know anything. It makes sense that he doesn't want his witness talking to people. But when I spoke to the deputy, I felt he knows you. Call it a bedside manner, although I swear to God he could make a living teaching bedside manner. I think it's his eyes. I nodded, remembering him looking over the top of a magazine next to my hospital bed. Dr. Jensen stood abruptly and pocketed his damn collar. Holding out a hand, he said, Good luck, Ben, or whatever your name is, and I hope you can talk to your wife soon. My wife? Dr. Jensen smiled. You kept saying you just wanted to talk to her one more time, over and over again. An hour later, I sat in stunned silence as Larry drove me to my new life, and I wondered if Dr. Jensen was back shocking his puppy. I felt bad for the little guy.